I wore my sister's hand-me-downs until I was 14, when I discovered that there's more to clothing than summer camp t-shirts and athletic shorts. I started shopping for myself and finding vintage dresses, overalls, and high-waisted jeans. I didn't know where all the clothes came from or how they got to be hanging on racks in Lincoln, Nebraska, when the labels said China, Bangladesh, Honduras, and El Salvador. It wasn't until last year that I learned how my clothes are really made, by teenage factory workers in brutal conditions. Girls my age are working between 12 and 22 hours a day, all for 5 to 10% of average US wages. That means that they are paid 12 cents for making a $20 shirt. At that rate, it'll take a day and a half just to make enough money for one can of Campbell's soup, which was bad news for a girl like 15-year-old CLAUDIA Molina, who once struggled to support her family of 5 by sewing clothes in Honduras. When I was 15, I was thinking about my friends and my grades, not about supporting my family. For me, the most important event of the year was the homecoming dance. I remember going to the store with my best friend and picking out the perfect dress. It was pink and made me feel like a fairy in a Midsummer Night's Dream. I offered to pay for it myself, but my dad told me he'd take care of it. Consider it a beginning of high school gift, he said. I didn't think much of letting him pay. I also didn't think much about the girls who had made that dress. Girls like CLAUDIA, whose dads can't provide clean water, much less spend $90 on a dress. In America, the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. If CLAUDIA had made that much when she was working at ORION Apparel, she'd have made enough money in one day to buy her family 58 cans of Campbell's soup. But instead, she'd probably have spent some of the money improving her family's home, which was a one-room shack with no running water. Like thousands of other teenage girls across the world, CLAUDIA had no choice but to work. Corporations took over the local economy and left citizens desperate. Children dropped out of school to help support their parents and siblings, many of whom are employed in similar conditions in other types of factories. The brand Free People, whose clothing is produced by teenagers in China, is starting to sound pretty ironic. The conditions at the factory where CLAUDIA worked, ORION Apparel, were made possible by free trade zones, areas where companies can manufacture goods with no trade barriers. Free trade zones were created with good intentions, to strengthen local economies and generate jobs. But companies take advantage of these areas to sidestep inspections and regulations, all in the name of making more money. And who pays for free trade zones? We do. They were made possible by US tax dollars. Companies like The Gap, Old Navy, Forever 21, Urban Outfitters, Anthropologie, and more are moving their productions overseas so that they don't have to pay minimum wage, grant maternity leave, or hire adults. American stores are avoiding American laws. These American laws were fought for by brave workers beginning in the 1800s. With their strikes and protests, they paved the way for the minimum wage, laws prohibiting child labor, and safe working conditions. But American companies have not respected those laws, or the people who made great sacrifices to create them. Instead, they moved their production to China, Bangladesh, Honduras, El Salvador, and more, and hire teenagers whom they force to work in conditions which violate their human rights. Then, they ship the goods back to the United States, where they are sold in every city in the country. We, the consumers, are never told more than the country on the label. We're never told about 17-year-old Jasmine of LIFENG factory in Shaanxi, China. It was Jasmine's job to cut the extra threads around the pockets of the jeans. Every hour, Jasmine made half a yuan, which is 6 cents. We're never told about Judith Vieira, an El Salvadoran teenager who sewed clothes for The Gap at a company called Mandarin International, until she and her sisters were fired for starting a union. The labels on our clothes don't tell us about 20-year-old MORIUM Begum of Bangladesh. When MORIUM became pregnant, her factory didn't give her maternity leave and instead forced her to work over 100 hours in 1 week. Due to stress and exhaustion, she lost her baby in her 7th month of pregnancy. MORIUM is not the first woman to suffer this fate. Some factories are so unwilling to grant workers maternity leave, they force them to take birth control pills. At ORION Apparel, girls were given birth control daily. They were told that it was for malaria, but workers like CLAUDIA knew better. If a worker did become pregnant, she was given a shot to abort the baby. But there is hope for the girls under the fluorescent lights of the factory. CLAUDIA and JUDITH were employed in the Central American factories in the mid-1990s. Since then, the Institute for Global Labor and Human Rights has worked tirelessly to abolish child labor. Once, factories preferred to hire teen girls because they said they had nimble fingers and learned quickly. But the Institute convinced the factories to hire the girls' parents instead. That way, the adults of the community could have a steady income, and the children could get an education. CLAUDIA and JUDITH are older now. They have children of their own. Children who can get an education, laugh and play with their friends, thanks to the unwavering dedication of their mothers, who led their countries to change. We can be inspired by the work of the Institute, CLAUDIA, and JUDITH, inspired to take the change that happened in El Salvador and Honduras and bring it to China and Bangladesh. There, girls my age are still working as much as 22 hours a day for pay as low as 6 cents an hour, while American companies benefit. If there is one thing everyone should know about the situation, Barbara Briggs of the Institute says, it is that it continues. It will continue until we put our foot down, until we insist on change. Workers who stand up for their rights are mistreated and fired. They lose their sole means of obtaining food and shelter. But we, the consumers, run no such risk. Companies will listen to us because they want to make money, and they can't do that without our cooperation. As consumers, we have tremendous power to create positive change for girls all over the world. We can do this, Barbara Briggs says, by asking companies what they are doing to ensure that child labor is not being used in production, asking what they are doing to protect workers' rights to form trade unions. We can ask by writing letters to Gap, Old Navy, and the rest, and asking what they are doing to protect workers like MORIUM, who lost her baby, and then her arm, when her Bangladesh factory collapsed. MORIUM and her friends refused to work in the unsafe building, but their boss threatened to withhold their paychecks if they didn't. When the building collapsed, MORIUM's arm was crushed by a sewing machine and a concrete block. If I had known about MORIUM when I was 15, if I had known about the workers who made clothes like that pink dress, I wouldn't have asked my dad or anyone else to buy it for me. We must demand that companies make their factories safe and fair for the women who work there, so that MORIUM's children do not have to undergo the same hell that she did. Then, adults can profit from their jobs instead of losing them. Children can have a chance for childhood and education before joining the workforce. And families can make not just a living, but a life. That's more fashionable than any clothing we could buy. Thank you.